Hi guys, today I'm going to read for you from Grimm's fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel. Hansel and Gretel couldn't sleep. Their cruel stepmother had sent them to bed without any supper, and their hungry tummies were rumbling loudly. Downstairs, they could hear raised voices. "What will become of us?" they heard their father say. "We're down to our last loaf of bread. I can't afford to buy more food for the children." "Never mind the children. We have to look after ourselves," snapped their stepmother. "Tomorrow we must take them into the forest and leave them there." "We can't do that," their father protested. "The wild animals would tear them apart." "Good riddance," their stepmother muttered under her breath. But aloud all she said was, "Nonsense! We can't survive on a woodcutter's wages. At least this way they stand a chance." "I suppose you're right," he sighed. When Gretel heard this, she began to sob. Hansel put his arm around his sister. "Don't cry," he said. "I've got an idea." Hansel waited until he heard snoring from the next room. Then he put on his coat and tiptoed outside. The moon was shining brightly, making the pebbles gleam on the garden path. He stuffed as many as he could into his pockets and hurried upstairs. The next morning, the children's stepmother woke them up really early. "Hurry up," she said sharply. "You must help us fetch firewood from the forest." She gave them each a small piece of bread to take with them. "Don't eat it all at once," she warned. As they walked through the forest, Hansel lagged behind. Every so often, when he was sure his stepmother wasn't looking, he dropped a pebble on the ground. They went deeper and deeper into the forest. Eventually, their father stopped. He gathered some sticks and made a fire to keep the children warm. "Wait here while we go and chop some wood," he said. All morning long, Hansel and Gretel heard the comforting chop, chop, chop of their father's hatchet in the distance. "Maybe they changed their minds," suggested Gretel hopefully. Lunchtime came and went, but their father and stepmother didn't return. Hansel and Gretel were very hungry, but they nibbled their bread slowly to make it last. As the afternoon wore on, it began to grow dark. The children added some sticks to the fire and lay down beside it. Before long, they were both fast asleep. By the time the children woke up, the fire had died down. They could still hear the thud of the hatchet, but in the darkness the noise sounded sinister. Hansel shivered. "Let's go and look for them," he said. They followed the sound, but found only the hatchet tied to a branch, swinging to and fro in the wind. "They've left us," whispered Gretel. Hansel took his sister's hand. "Come with me," he said. "I've left a trail so we can find our way back." Sure enough, the white pebbles shone in the moonlight, showing them the way home. It was morning by the time the children arrived at the cottage. They knocked at the door and their father answered it. He was delighted to see them safe, but their stepmother was far from happy. That night, Hansel and Gretel overheard her nagging their father again. "We must get rid of those children or we'll all starve," she said. "What choice do we have?" The woodcutter had no answer, and so reluctantly he agreed to his wife's demands. Hansel waited until they were asleep and sneaked downstairs to collect pebbles just as before. But this time his stepmother was one step ahead of him. The door was locked. He went back upstairs to Gretel. "Don't worry," he told her. "I'll think of something." The next day, their father gave them each a piece of bread, and he and his wife took them into the forest once again. Hansel broke his bread into tiny pieces. Every now and then, when no one was looking, he scattered a few crumbs on the ground. This time, their stepmother led them even deeper into the forest. "I'll make sure they'll never find their way out," she said to herself. As the woodcutter built a fire for his children, a tear rolled down his cheek. "Smoke in my eyes," he mumbled. After their father and stepmother had gone, Gretel shared the bread with Hansel. Then they huddled together beside the fire for warmth. They were so tired that they soon dozed off. When they woke up, only the red embers of the fire were glowing and the daylight was starting to fade. Hansel hunted around for the trail of bread, but there was no sign of it. "I'm sure it was around here," he said. Just then, a snow-white bird flew down and began pecking at something on the ground. It was one of the pieces of bread that Hansel had dropped. "Stop that!" he cried. The bird was so startled that it fluttered away, carrying its prize in its beak. Hansel ran to and fro, searching for the rest of his trail, but it was too late. The hungry bird had eaten it all. "I think this is the way we came," said Gretel, pointing to a muddy track. The children followed it, but the forest soon became thicker and it was so difficult to get through. "I'm not sure this is right," said Hansel. They tried to turn back, but they couldn't find a way. Every direction looked the same. On and on the children stumbled, all through the night and into the next morning. They wandered round in circles until they were completely lost. By this time they were so exhausted they could barely stand. Then, just as they were ready to give up hope, the trees thinned out and they found themselves in a pretty forest glade. Hansel and Gretel stared in amazement. There, before them, was the most extraordinary little house they had ever seen. It had gingerbread walls decorated with little sweets and chocolate roof tiles dripping with sugary icing. Instead of flowers in the garden, there were scrumptious-looking cupcakes, giant lollipops, and swirly candle canes. There could hardly have been a more welcome sight for the two hungry children. Gretel ran up the path and licked one of the lollipops. "It's real!" she exclaimed. "Let's eat some," said Hansel excitedly. They nibbled the fence, munched through the window latches, and were just about to break off the door knocker, and did that too, when the door swung open. An old woman peered out at them. "Who are you?" she groaned. "Have you been eating my house?" Hansel and Gretel nodded fearfully. With their cheeks stuffed with gingerbread and chocolate all around their mouth, they could hardly deny it. The old woman gave a toothless grimace. "Poor things, you must be ravenous," she said. "Come inside and you shall eat your fill." She seemed harmless enough, and the two children were still very hungry, so they followed her inside. But the moment they were through the door, she slammed it shut and locked it. "Foolish brats," cackled the old woman. "You walked right into my trap." Grabbing poor Hansel by the ear, she dragged him out of the chicken coop in the backyard and threw him inside. "You'll make a tasty supper once I fatten you up," she crowned. The witch, for that was what she was, made Gretel work like a slave, preparing food for her brother. From morning until night, the girl peeled and chopped, boiled and stewed, roasted and baked, while the witch sat in a rocking chair counting jewels from her treasure chest. After a week had gone by, the witch went out to the chicken coop. "Let me feel your plump little finger," she said to Hansel. But Hansel was too clever for her. Instead of his finger, he poked an old chicken bone out through the bars. The witch peered at the bone and prodded it. "What a scrawny creature!" she exclaimed. Her eyesight was so poor that she couldn't tell the difference between a bone and a finger. From then on, the witch made Gretel work even harder. The girl cooked huge cauldrons of hearty stew with dumplings, fried strings of sizzling sausages, and baked dozens of pies and cakes for her brother. All this time, the witch sat greedily leafing through her books for tasty boy recipes. But when she checked Hansel's finger at the end of the week, it was just as thin as before. After a month had gone by, Hansel was still no chubbier. The witch, who was used to getting her way, finally lost her temper. "Today I'm going to eat your brother, skinny or not," she said to Gretel. "Heat up the oven at once." The witch followed Gretel's every move as the girl stoked up the fire. "Now get inside and check that it's starting to heat up," she said slyly, for secretly she planned to eat both the children. But Gretel guessed what she was up to. "I can't fit in there," she declared. "Of course you can, you silly goose," snapped the witch. "I'm much bigger than you and I can easily fit inside." "Well, I really don't know how," said Gretel innocently. "You're much older and wiser than I am. Perhaps you could show me?" With a snort of impatience, the witch pushed her aside and flung open the oven door. "Like this," she said, thrusting her head inside. As quick as a flash, Gretel ran forward and gave her a big shove. Then she slammed the oven door and fastened it shut. "Let me out!" shrieked the witch, banging on the door. But Gretel didn't listen. She filled her pockets with jewels from the witch's treasure chest. Then she grabbed the key to the chicken coop and ran outside to rescue her brother. "What's happening?" asked Hansel as Gretel opened the door. "I've cooked the wicked witch," gasped Gretel. "Quickly, let's escape." "But how will you find the way?" said Hansel. At that moment, there was a rustle in the tree above. The children looked up and saw the bird that had eaten their bread. It flew to the next tree and waited with its head cocked. "I think it wants us to follow it," said Gretel. So the children followed the bird through the forest until eventually they came to a stream with a rickety wooden bridge over it. "I know that bridge," said Hansel. "We're nearly home." They thanked the bird and hurried off in the direction of their father's cottage. He was standing outside and looked up when he heard them coming. "My children!" he cried. They ran into his arms and he hugged them tightly. "I've missed you so much," he wept. "Please forgive me." The three of them went inside. Hansel and Gretel looked around worriedly, but there was no sign of their stepmother. "She left when the food ran out," their father explained. "There's not a crumb left in the house. I don't know how we'll manage, but I'll find a way," he promised. "Perhaps these will help," said Gretel, emptying the witch's jewels out onto her lap. "Where on earth did these come from?" asked Hansel in surprise. Gretel tapped her finger on her nose. "You're not the only one with clever ideas, Hansel," she said with a smile.